This is my interview with Larry Ahern, recorded for my documentary The Making of Day of the Tentacle for this year's 30th anniversary. Larry was lead animator on Day of the Tentacle and worked on several LucasArts games since, including as co-project lead on The Curse of Monkey Island alongside Jonathan Ackley. He's since worked for Microsoft and then for Disney, creating interactive attractions again with Jonathan. There's a Twitter link below where you can follow Larry and links to the full playlist of interviews and the full documentary. As always, I've edited out some pleasantries at the start, so we'll jump right in. Enjoy! Firstly, just going right back, what was your kind of background in art and how did you actually come to work for LucasArts originally?
Yeah, sure, I've told this story a million times, but maybe I'll for those of you who haven't heard it before, or I'll put a different spin on it. I had always been interested in cartooning. I'd always done that as a kid, and in high school and college, I was dabbling in that. I think I ended up getting a fine art degree in college, but that wasn't really my plan. It was mostly because the school I went to, that was the only art program they had. I had started out in the sciences and then suddenly had a panic and realized, what am I thinking? I'm not going to be a scientist. So I switched to art, and like, all right, I'll get the fine art degree. But I at that point, I just assumed I'll finish the degree and then I may have to go on to an art college or something if I want to, get some more specific skills. And at that point, it was like I think the only real full-time job you could get as an artist, that was a guaranteed income would be like in graphic design. So I kind of thought maybe I'll have to do that. But of course, straight out of college, I was just doing cartooning, and I did a bunch of freelance illustration work. And I did a bunch of t-shirt designs, actually. This was back in the 80s. So a bunch of cartoon designs for t-shirts and that kind of thing, coffee mugs, calendars. So that was kind of fun. I actually had a startup company that I did with some friends from college, and it was sort of some spoof surfwear called couch surfing in activewear, like instead of activewear. And so it was this cartoon of this big fat guy on a couch, but he was out on the waves surfing and that kind of thing. We actually made a go of that, had it at some trade shows and had it in some department stores and that kind of thing. But we didn't know anything about running a business. It was funny. The thing that sunk us was the thing that should have been what kicked off our success. We basically got a bunch of orders from some huge department stores, but the way that works is they put in the order and you have to deliver the merchandise, and then they don't pay you for like another 3 months. So if we knew what we were doing, we would have got some kind of financing or business loan or something like that. But essentially it put us out of business. Or like I had to go off and get another job, and we're like, well, that's it for us. There's our big success. So I was doing stupid stuff like that. And I met, and I can tell this is going to be the long version of the story, so feel free to edit. I met a guy. I joined a artist guild in Sacramento where I was living at the time, and met a guy there that was working at LucasArts. And I think this was a couple of years before I actually got the job. And myself and another friend, Anson Ju, who also ended up working at LucasArts at the same time as I did, we met this guy, Martin Cameron, and found out he was working at LucasArts. And we're like, oh my gosh, you work for George Lucas. That's amazing. And of course, we were at an art show where everybody was doing their illustration work and had that on display. And he's like, yes, but it's not art like this. It's like, 4-color giant colored bricks. It's like, it's not real art. We're like, yeah, but still, you work at Skywalker Ranch. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. He's like, yeah, but we're doing, Lego people. It's not real. We're like, oh, it still sounds amazing, And then I think it was like a couple of years later, I was roommates with Anson at the time, and Martin calls up, and I just happened to answer the phone, and he was asking for Anson. And I go, no, he's not here. Or can I take a message? And he goes, yeah, tell him Martin's calling, and wanted to see if he'd be available for an interview at LucasArts. And then I just kind of sat on the phone for a long time going, is it appropriate for me to say something? I feel like I need to say something. And then finally I go, hey, Martin, this is Larry, actually. And he goes, oh, Larry, I didn't realize you guys were roommates. I didn't recognize your voice. How are you? And I go, good. And then another really long pause. And then finally I go, how many openings you got there at LucasArts? They go, oh, geez, I can't believe I didn't think of that. Yeah, we got to hire several people. Yeah, you guys should both come down. That'd be great. Both of you guys come on down. We'll do an interview. I'm glad you said something, but I was still horrified. Like, is this inappropriate for me to do? And then I thought, oh, this is great. And it didn't even occur to me until we get down there to go into the interview. And then suddenly it crossed my mind, crap, what if I get hired and Anson doesn't? That would be horrible. Again, me just taking over the interview. What was I thinking? But thankfully we both got hired. We drove down and it turned out that Anson's brother at the time was already working at ILM. And so he lived down there. We were able to sleep on his couch, stayed over for the weekend when we did the interview, and drove out to Skywalker Ranch, showed Gary Winnick was the art director at the time, showed him our portfolios. And I remember, like, most of the interview, he was touring us around and showing us Secret of Monkey Island. And it felt like a real sales pitch kind of thing. Like he was spending a lot of time showing us all the cool stuff they're doing. And I'm thinking, I'm at Skywalker Ranch. I don't care if we're sweeping up. This is just amazing. We don't need to do all this. And then at the end, when he's like, let's see your resumes, he opens mine and he looks like at the first page or two, and then just kind of flips through it just really fast. And my jaw was like on the floor thinking, oh crap, he's not even looking at it. And then he looks over and he sees the expression on my face and he's like, oh no, don't worry. I just kind of wanted to get a sense of if you can draw or not. And I just saw the first couple ones like, yeah, these guys can draw, no problem. And then talking to them later, I found out their challenge was they were hiring a lot of illustrators and comic book artists, and they had a hard time convincing those people to come work in video games because of the 4-color brick limited pixelated stuff they were doing. It's like, yeah, you could be doing something more creative than this. But of course, at the time, the reason they needed to hire people was because it was transitioning. It had gone to 16 color. And then I think we were the phase where it was 256. And they're like, oh my God, this takes like 4 times as long to do the backgrounds. And, we can do all these colors and the characters and whatever. So they were expanding a lot. And so I think at the time, then they said, that was a Friday, and they're like, okay, can you come in on Monday and do an art test? And they go, everything looks good, but we just want to make sure, you can kind of get the hang of it, because sometimes people have trouble with the computer. And we're like, sure. So then, we're asking Anson's brother, can we stay over for the weekend? Because we don't want to drive. We were like 3 hours drive away. So he's like, yeah, no problem. So we did that, and we came in and did the art test. And I remember, like, I had used a computer before, but I had never done art on a computer. I'd taken like a basic programming class in college and hated it, actually. But and like at the time, I had played arcade video games, but I had never really played a computer game. I think a friend of mine was a computer science major in college, and I was only like 4 or 5 years out of college. And the games that he was showing me were just like really simple dungeon crawl things where it was like, you're the ampersand and you're being attacked by the asterisks, there's no art to it or anything. And then they show us Secret of Monkey Island. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I want to do this. So we came in for the art test, and I remember they're like, why don't you just do like a background painting in Deluxe Paint, And they kind of showed us some of the controls, and like, figure it out, spend a couple hours, come up with something. And I remember doing it, and I remember working on the stuff with the mouse. And as I'm doing it, my mouse is like moving farther and farther and farther. And then pretty soon it's like, oh, it's going to go off the mouse pad. I didn't realize you could like pick it up and reset it. And I panicked at first because I'm like, the mouse is all the way over here, and how do I get it back? So it's like, that's what I was dealing with at the time. But did the art, figured it out. Anson and I both got hired, and they brought us in, and then we did a training thing. I think it was like a month's worth of training where the most of the production group at LucasArts at the time, it was still Lucasfilm Games then, this was 1990, they were down in San Rafael, but because they had outgrown the facility at the ranch there, but they still had, I think it was some of the people working on the Nintendo games at the time were still up at the ranch. And then the art director was doing a Nintendo game, so he was up there. And then the new people he brought in, he had the training at the ranch. So I spent the first month of my job there at the ranch, you know, eating the fancy lunches at the dining hall there and walking around the lake or up in the mountains, you know, after lunch. It was crazy amazing. And just learning to use the animation tools and doing stuff like that. And then ended up down at the San Rafael facility. And I remember at the time, Gary was saying, okay, so we got 2 projects coming up. And one of them is the Dig. This was the first version that Noah Falstein was in charge of. And then the other one, we're doing a sequel to Monkey Island. So can't guarantee it, but, you know, let me know your preference and, you know, we'll see what we can put you on. So I'm like, I want to do the Monkey Island game. That's my thing. And so, of course, I got put on the Dig. And I'm trying to think, actually, Anson and I both got put on the Dig. But that was a cool project, and it ended up getting shelved. I'm trying to think. I think we worked on it for like 6 months or so. But sorry, I'm rambling on. Am I answering the question?
That's
Should
perfect.
I just keep
Yeah,
talking?
perfect.
So yeah, we got assigned to the Dig. Dave Grossman was actually a writer and designer on that as well, working with Noah. And I think initially they wanted to do rotoscoping for the characters. So it ended up being where they did video of people walking on a treadmill and that kind of thing. I want to say that Anson was working on some of that stuff initially. So a lot of it was like you had to clean up because it was just chaotic, you know, a lot of noise as it was trying to crunch it down to that low resolution and trying to clean it up and make it look reasonable and kind of stylize it a little bit. We both ended up working on that somewhat, but then Ken Macklin was the background artist, the conceptual designer that kind of was creating the alien worlds and that kind of thing. I ended up working on a bunch of the layouts for the different alien locations with him. So he had sort of set the style, and then he handed it off to me to do some of the other locations based on that architectural style or weird alien plants that he had come up with. Sort of like, here's the raw ingredients, you know, that you can use, you know, to make your thing, and do that. And if you create some other stuff, do it in this style, you know, and go nuts and come up with it. And then we had sort of a rough listing of all the different locations that were going to be in the game. So I did a bunch of the layout drawings on that. I could do the pencil stuff, but I didn't do color. So I was just going to do that. And then I suppose Ken or some other people were going to come in and paint it. We never got that far. Ken did some color versions of his drawings. And then I think we had a rough thing sort of wired up where you could walk through the different environments, but a lot of them were still in black and white. And then trying to think if it ended up where we had a demo version of it or what, but it ended up being shelved. I think the challenge, he was trying to do kind of a hybrid of role-playing game and adventure game. And so if I remember correctly, there was resources that you had to collect out on the planet surface and that kind of thing. And back then it was, we were using, God, I forget what they called them, but the idea was to kind of have generic pieces of location art where you could swap in plants and trees and caves and mountain ranges and change stuff around. So it's sort of like use like 5 different background things and, you know, 25 different pieces and swap them left and right and whatever, and you can create, you know, 50 or 100 different locations. And so that was the idea, but I think in practice it ended up feeling like I'm walking from room to room to room, and they all just kind of feel the same, even though technically they're different. And I'm looking for that one resource so that my character doesn't die. So I think that was the problem, was like, it was a little slow. Mm-hmm. So that got shelved. And at that point, it's like, well, Ron desperately needs help on Monkey Island too. And I'm like, yes, I finally get to work on that. So, and at that point it was like, well, yeah, but you have to do a test, you know, to see if you're going to fit on the project. So Ron came in and he said, we got a dog that we're going to do. And that was the jail scene with the dog with the keys in his mouth. That was an homage, shall I say, not, wasn't stolen from Disneyland. It was an homage to the Pirates of the Caribbean. So he's like, yeah, we need that. Why don't you see if you can do a dog walking animation? I can't remember if I designed the dog or somebody already had art for it, but so I remember just getting the Edward Maybridge sequential animal photograph thing, like, you know, that was the kind of reference we had laying around. Here's you know, frame by frame to see how a horse runs or a dog walks or whatever. So I looked at a bunch of that stuff to figure out how to do the animation of the dog walking, and did that, and then did a couple of things with the keys in his mouth and that kind of thing. And Ron liked it, so he said, okay, you're on the project. And then I ended up, I think most of the stuff I did was actually Guybrush and LeChuck scenes, because Steve Purcell, I think, did a bunch of the more heroic moments, the main story moments, and, you know, the animation for those main characters. But he was also doing a bunch of the background art, and I think he had other stuff going. He painted the box cover, all that kind of stuff. So it was more like, okay, we need someone to backfill Steve's work, because there's a million Guybrush animations. So I did a bunch of goofy stuff for that. And then trying to think. Oh yeah, and then sorry, I know this is a Day of the Tentacle, long story long. So I will say that as I was doing a bunch of the Guybrush animations, I kept like playing around with like if I was waiting for an assignment from Ron or whatever, I got time to kill, I'd do something like I had an animation where an anvil dropped on Guybrush's head, and then I had another one. I think that one was just me goofing around, but there was another one that was actually in the game where Guybrush steps on a rake and it hits him in the face. Yeah, and I forget, the actual version of that was a little more tame. I think it hits him in the face and he goes, whoa, or maybe he falls, I can't remember. But of course, the first version that I did, it hits him in the face and all his teeth fall out. And Ron kept looking at this stuff and he's like, yeah, that's too far. You can't do, that's not Guybrush. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but it's fun. I want to do this kind of thing. So you could tell this was the stuff that I was pushing for. So when we got the chance to do Day of the Tentacle, talking to Tim and Dave, Tim Schafer and Dave Grossman, it was like, we should do that kind of stuff, you know, because it's like we had the original Maniac Mansion that we were looking at, and we're like, yeah, you can't really take anything from that because that technology was years back, and they were so limited in what they could do. They really didn't have an animation style. You could barely just have the characters walking around like that, a two frame walk cycle. So like we need a style, you know, let's do like Looney Tunes. So they're like, yeah, that sounds fun. So we started exploring that, and Peter Chan started looking at a bunch of the Chuck Jones. Maurice Noble was one of the background artists that worked on a lot of those Warner Brothers cartoons, the Bugs Bunnies and that kind of thing. And so Peter started kind of saying, all right, what if I took the mansion and did it in that style? And then I started doing some character designs. And it's interesting because at the time, a lot of the most recent games had smaller characters, and I'm not sure if that was like, again, a technology thing. Like if the characters are a little smaller, then we can do more frames of animation, because there was always memory issues you were butting up against. Because in hindsight now, I look back and it's like, well, Zach McCracken and the first Maniac Mansion actually had bigger characters and they had bigger heads, but the Monkey Island games and Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, some of the more recent ones, they were all smaller. So the characters just had little black pixel dots for eyes. And I was like, I want them more expressive. So I want to go back to the big heads thing. So that let me kind of get expressions on their faces, and you could see the whites of their eyes with some of them. Hoagie, you couldn't see his eyes at all, but you know, it allowed us to kind of get expressions to the characters. I'm like, that's what we need. So when the characters are actually doing stuff, they can have goofy looks on their faces. So I think I did. I mean, the character designs all started on paper. So I think I did the first, probably started with Bernard, and then did Hoagie and Laverne. I know originally we were supposed to have 6 characters, like the first game, you know, lots of characters to swap between. So trying to remember, it was those 3, and then Moonglow and Razor, who was also in the first game, and trying to remember, I think it was Curtis was another guy.
I think it was Chester, the third one.
Chester, there you go. That sounds right.
And he's the
what
one
do I know? It's 30 years ago.
Well, yeah, I think he's the one. He's the one who got repurposed.
Yeah, definitely. I like that design. And when we had Ned and Jed, I don't remember all these damn names. Sorry.
That's it exactly. Yeah, Ned and Jed.
Yeah, I was like, oh, use that for those guys. That was a fun design. And then I'm trying to think. I think Moonglow got reused as one of the colonial era characters, but she had a bonnet on, whatever. She didn't have the same hair, so you could barely tell it was the same character. Might have been Betsy Ross or one of those. I can't remember. And then Razor didn't get used. She was kind of extreme. But yeah, so that was fun. And then the challenge there was like, okay, this is the concept on paper, but that was the early days when we had just gotten scanners and we're figuring out how to use it, but the resolution we were working in was still so chunky. It's like you take a character that's that small, I'd scan it in and you could get the silhouette, but like all the detail in the face was just pixelated mess. You had to start all over, but at least the scan would give me the proportions of my drawing, and then I kind of had to rebuild it from there. The good thing was, because we were going with the Looney Tunes animated style, then, you know, the characters weren't going to have a lot of detail. It was going to be flat color. And then I was trying to kind of give it a look of having an outline like an animated show would have. And you can do that in some parts, and other areas of too much detail, you kind of have to leave it out. But that was kind of the approach. You know, how do you rebuild it in pixels now to have the same feel as the drawing? And it's interesting because I go back now and I look at my concept drawings for the character designs, and like a lot of times you'll see games and you'll see like these gorgeous paintings. You know, this is what we envision for the characters. And then you see what ends up in the game. You're like, yeah, I can kind of see that. But that art that you started with, that was the thing. I wish it looked like that. And mine, like all those early games, I didn't spend that much effort on the thing, because I'm like, the pixelated game version is going to be a whole separate piece of art that I'm going to have to do. Why spend all this time doing? So a lot of my concept art or character design art was pretty scrappy, because it's like, I'm just trying to get the vibe. I got to build it in pixels, or, you know, it's kind of wasted effort. So on the other hand, now I look back and it's like, it would be nice to have a beautiful painted version of the thing. I never bothered doing any of that. Like Peter Chan always did these gorgeous concept, you know, color concept pieces, but the backgrounds translated a little better into pixels than the characters did. So I never did a heck of a lot on those, but it's funny. So now I look back at the drawings and I'm like, yeah, I don't consider the character drawings to be the definitive version. I think the pixelated versions are better. And I even worked on the special edition, and they asked me to kind of go in and do high res versions. Like what is the high res version of the color character on screen look like? And I did some poses for that, but I still kind of look at certain frames of animation in that high res one. And I'm like, yeah, that's not the right nose, you know, because it's like, there's a thing that the pixels suggest for me, and it may not even be the same thing that other people who play the game see, but it's like, I look at the pixels and this is what I see, you know? So it's funny. But yeah, it was a blast creating those characters. I think the first one I got going in color was Bernard, and I did a walk cycle for him, and we put it in front of one of Peter's early backgrounds, and yeah, there wasn't a lot of conversation about it. It's funny because it was like a lot of projects I've worked on since, you know, you like stumble around and struggle with a couple of different approaches. You know, what should it be? I don't know. Let's try this. Let's try that. You do a million different versions of what the characters might look like until you hit on something. In fact, the next game I worked on, Full Throttle, we went through a bunch of versions, you know, before we got one we liked. But with Day of the Tentacle, I think it was literally like, this is kind of my cartooning style already, and then I'm going to kind of exaggerate, make the heads bigger. Like, it was just, I'm going to do the way I cartoon, and I just did it, and they're like, that looks great, you know? So there was like no real conversation about it. It was more just like, if we're designing a new character, what does he look like? You know, my interpretation of Bernard was not really discussed much. It was like, that looks great, let's do it, you know? And it's like, in hindsight, it's like, I've never worked on a project that went as smoothly as Day of the Tentacle. And I think you've probably heard that from other sources. Like, everybody said it was sort of that sweet spot where everybody that worked on it had worked on a couple games before, so we kind of knew how to do them. We had some new bells and whistles with the technology that allowed us to do some new stuff. We got to do bigger, better animations and characters. So it was sort of like plussing up what we already knew how to do, but it wasn't so wide open that you could do anything and be kind of paralyzed by that, you know, anything goes option. So it's like, oh, we can do cooler things. We know the kinds of things we want to do. We all had something in mind, and we put it together, and the game wasn't so open-ended that we ended up getting in a crazy, you know, death march crunch to finish it, because it's like, again, there were limitations, so there's only so much you could do with it. It's like, this is as good as this gets, let's make it good and then move on. And the team was small, which makes a lot of the production problems go away. When you have fewer people, you can just talk to the person working on the thing, you know, whereas you get a team of 50 or 100 or more people, and it's like, then you need middle management layers and, you know, detailed lists and, you know, all that, because people can't just collaborate, you know. I mean, a lot of that was like, I turned to the person at the desk next to me and go, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? You know, oh yeah, let me work on that while you're doing this. And then a lot of it is like, you draw something or animate something, and this was back in the olden days. It's like, you do your art, then you put it on a floppy disk, then you carry that floppy disk across the street to the other building where Tim and Dave worked, because we had I'm trying to think. No, actually, this was before we had the two buildings. So this was me walking down the hall, but still I had to put it on a floppy disk, because it's not like we were all wired together. Put it on a floppy disk, walk down the hall. They loaded up on their machine to look at the art. They're like, yeah, it looks great, that's funny. And then we'd brainstorm some stuff and go back and work on it. And yeah, it was interesting, because it's like, games nowadays, it's like you also create the whole story structure, and then you know, might be scripting stuff or whatever. Back then it was more like, they kind of had the story arc, and they had the designs for the puzzles, which was, I mean, design and story kind of go together like that anyway. But it was sort of like, this is the basic story outline, and the puzzles fit this way. And then they created a location list from that. These are all the places we need, and we know this puzzle needs a reverse camera angle on that location, or at a close-up or whatever. So we kind of had that was Peter's, you know, marching orders. But then a lot of the stuff that I was doing was like, well, here's the puzzle list and the cutscene list, so you need to make an animation list out of that. But then a lot of what was happening in the scene specifically, the script wasn't written yet. It was just like, Bernard's going to go into this room and he's going to get item number 2 or whatever it might be. and it's a thing. And maybe Tim and Dave had come up with a funny idea, like, there's there's a chicken on top of it or whatever. I'm not thinking of a specific example. But it hadn't really been figured out. So it's like, I'd look at the list and it's like, well, the animation needed for this is Bernard reaching out and grabbing the chicken or what, and it's like, okay, well, that's not very entertaining, so then the fun thing was, I mean, I didn't get writing credit, but technically I was coming up with gags. It's like, if I'm going to animate this, what's going to make it funny? So I'd go, well, wouldn't it be funny if he slips on a banana peel and then knocks the chicken over and then it lands on his head and that's how he gets, or whatever. That's a terrible example. I wish I could think of a real example from the game, but it was 30 years ago. So
yeah, I mean, the only sort of special case animation I can think of off the top of my head is like when when you give the coffee to Dr. Fred and he's like got all the steam coming out of his ears and stuff like that.
So that's stuff like that, or the exploding cigar.
Yes.
I mean, the concept of the puzzle was there's an exploding cigar, and then I got to figure out eyes going. But then I'm thinking one of the more elaborate ones was he goes up in the attic and the bed snaps on him. I forget if there was a puzzle where there's something in the bed and you have to open it, but there's a bunch of convoluted stuff and he falls out the window and, so I got to figure out all the gags and fun animation that would go with all that stuff. And so that was a blast. And then trying to remember, they had the concept for Hogue Vernard when the kids get combined. And it's like, and so then I came up with the idea, like, well, let's have Dr. Fred pull in the X-ray machine, and do that whole gag where it's like, you guys, you're just, in the same clothes. What are you doing? So that was a blast. That whole project was just kind of like that. And it was a lot of like, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we do that? Oh yeah, okay, try that, and then I'd kind of rough out the animation and show it to them and they'd go, oh, that's great, let's do it, and then I'm trying to think I want to say there was only 3 or 4 of us animating at the time, so it wasn't a huge team. It was just a lot of like, I think I did maybe about a third of the animation in the game, and then had a bunch of other people that were working on other scenes. And it back then it was like, I mean, I think technically my title was lead animator. It eventually evolved into animation director as the teams got bigger. Then you kind of had to you had to plot out stuff a little bit more. But back then I think it was more like I was the lead in that I had sort of set the direction and set the style. And then when I was, doling out animations to other people, it was more like, well, here's the character, here's the idea for the scene, this is what the puzzle needs to do. I was thinking this might be funny, but if you have any ideas, that'd be cool too.
I suppose one question was who did the do you remember who did the intro? Because there's this huge animated intro.
Yeah. So that was Kyle Balda. He's it's funny, he was an intern at the time. I want to say, I think he went to CalArts maybe. Anyway, it was an animation program. Like back then when we were doing stuff, it was funny. It's like everybody that stumbled into that job was like maybe a comic book artist or an illustrator or whatever. Like I had no animation background. I had dabbled with it a little bit did a stop motion project in a college film class. And then I had tried, in fact, when I was roommates with Anson a couple of years before we got the job at LucasArts, we said, well, oh, why don't we do an animation project? That'd be really cool. And then we started planning out and it's like, oh, that's so complicated. And then finally we just said, what if we just like do a thing where it's like sort of straight ahead motion? Like we didn't want to like plan it out because then that gets complicated and you're keyframing everything. We're like, what if we just do a thing where you have a character on the page and I have a character on the page and they just do some stuff, So it's like, you'll make your character, go from A to B to C to D, wherever it goes, and I'll do mine. And it was like 30 seconds or a minute long or whatever. And it was just random stuff. And it was like, man, that takes forever. Yeah, I wouldn't want to do that for a living. No, me neither. And then we get to LucasArts, and of course it's like, oh, I want to do the backgrounds, that because that's the cool stuff that the real artists are doing. It's like, yeah, but I wasn't really a painter. I wasn't as good as people like Steve Purcell and Mark Ferrari. And it's like, and we need animation. And at that point, I'm like, oh, well, I'm getting paid to do it. That's totally different. And then it's like, I seemed to pick it up pretty quick. I had a knack for it. So, but everybody was sort of that way. It's like learning on the job. And then Kyle comes along and it's like, ooh, he studied animation. That's completely different. He like knows things about it. And I'm trying to remember Bill Tiller, ironically, amazing background artist. He actually had an animation degree. So when he came to the company originally, he knew how to animate. He had gone to CalArts, evolved into a background artist and didn't animate much after that. But yeah, Kyle coming in and knowing a bunch about animation, we're like, oh, what kinds of things could we do? And they're like, well, what if we do this fun animated opening? And all the previous games always used to be just a lot of still frames of art, thematically related to the game concept. It's like we could actually animate some stuff, because we realized if we kept it to like 3 colors, I think we did. So we're like, it's a nighttime scene. It's just a couple of different shades of blue or whatever it was. And we're like, that is limited enough detail that we could actually do some big animations in the scene. So then trying to remember how that came together. I think the idea was just like, okay, we'll do a starting scene with the kids saying we got to go to the mansion, and then it's the crazy hijinks of them getting there. And I'm pretty sure Kyle dreamed up most of that. I know he worked with Peter. Peter came up with the different locations, but I think the two of them mapped that out, and it was just nuts. It was great. That was a project that Kyle worked on, and I want to say that he was like an intern for a short period. So it wasn't like he was around to work on the whole game. It's like, we got Kyle for X amount of time and let's have him do this because it's a great kind of standalone piece that he can do. And it turned out awesome. And then I took the whole thing. I saw the thing with the truck going through the barn, and I'm like, oh, we should add a cow to that. So I put the little cow in at the end, and then the 3 kids and the cow running to the mansion, and then the cow stopping and like, wait a minute, why am I going to the mansion? He's like, oh, you guys go on without me. So I added the dumb cow gag. And then yeah, but the thing that was a blast there was the fact that we got to do big scenes like that. I think that was the first game where we really got to do those impactful scenes, and we had a couple of close-up scenes with the characters screaming and the tongues wagging and all that stuff. That was like that was a challenge, because we're like, you can only move, I forget what it was, but it was like you can only have 25% of the pixels on the screen change, at any one moment. So it's like, how do we make it feel like there's this big full animation happening, but it's actually not moving more than 25% of the stuff? So that was sort of like the tongues wagging were pretty big, but then the faces, they were just kind of shifting a little bit, and the eyes were kind of bulging and whatever. So it's like, it wasn't wild. It wasn't a character moving across the screen or anything huge like that. So we were able to.
Do you use color cycling and stuff like that for some of the animations, like, during the game?
I'm trying to remember if we did that. Peter would know better than I do, but I want to say that we actually did real animation for that stuff. Like, I'm remembering the toxic sludge stream. I think that was all real animation. We had the bubbling thing on the machine. I don't know if we used color cycling on this. I think part of the reason color cycling worked well on some of the other games is if they had a more of a realistic style, and we were going for such a cartoony style that the stuff that would be moving is more flat color stuff. And I don't know. Plus I want to say that, like, I remember color cycle, like Bill Eakin, who worked on Fate of Atlantis. He was kind of He was the guy. Well, Mark Ferrari was
Yeah.
the expert of color cycling, and then he left. I don't know if it was after Loom or when that was. So he was gone, and then Bill Eakin, who's the lead artist on Fate of Atlantis, sort of took the mantle from him. I want to say he worked with Mark and learned some of his tricks, and then he was trying to push the envelope on that. So they did a lot of that on Fate of Atlantis, but I don't think that was Peter's thing. It was more of a technical trick, and Peter was like, yeah, I don't know how that works. I don't want to know how that works. And none of us animators really got into it either. And we were trying to do more stylized stuff. So I could be wrong. Maybe there's some color cycling hidden in some corners here and there, but as a general approach, I don't think that was a thing we did in DOTT.
Jonathan told me that that you had some elaborate sludge-o-matic machine animation that he had to cut, and
oh yeah,
it
yeah,
wouldn't fit in, and
he fixed it. So I don't know if maybe he did some color cycling in that.
Oh no, I don't. I do you know what I was thinking about with the color cycling was the you know, like where they're traveling through time in the chronogens, and it's all
Oh
like
yeah, there might be some
swirly.
in there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, don't trust me. I'm not the expert. It's too
No,
long
yeah.
ago. But I'll remember the general vibe. Yeah, the animation that Jonathan was talking about, that was because I had the thing was like squashing and stretching and doing all kinds of fun bubbly stuff. And you know, some of the things you work on like that. I think the deal with that one was because it was a background element that was animated, it had a lot more colors because you wanted it to match the detail of the background painting. So like the character stuff you could get more elaborate with because they had flat colors, so there's less data you're pushing around. But anytime something that was part of the background had to come to life, then you're pushing around more data because it had shading and highlights and that kind of thing. And I think that one had all kinds of weird swirly colors in the ooze and the sludge, and then had shading on the little capsule thing that was in, and then the whole thing on the pipe went up and down and bubbled. And I just had fun with it. And then Jonathan just shook his head and like, we can't do that. So I think he went through and just kind of grabbed the keyframes, the extremes, and made it a lot more poppy. Like, all right, whatever. That's better than the last game we worked on. I won't complain.
Yeah, I mean, did you find that much with, obviously, like, you know, you could do more than the previous games, but did you run into many hurdles with stuff like memory?
You know, I don't remember. We definitely were problem solving for that, but like I don't remember getting into situations where other than the sludge-o-matic one that you mentioned with Jonathan, I don't remember getting into situations where we did work and then found out, oh, this isn't going to work and we have to tear it apart or do it again. I think that was the only example. And I think I kind of knew that one probably wasn't going to work, but I didn't care. I wanted to make a cool thing, and it wasn't very time consuming, put it that way. It was elaborate, and it was more like stylistically, this is what I want it to be. It wasn't like I spent days on it. It was a little background animation thing. So it wasn't super time consuming. So that was more of a situation probably of me going, this may not work, but it's not time consuming enough to worry about it. Let me just do the animation that I want, and then we'll figure out if we can make it work or not. Whereas like some of the character stuff, you'd go into it and you're like, we're doing a full screen character thing. Let's problem solve this. Let's kind of plot out and figure out what do we think is possible with it. Like I want to say one of the bigger ones that I'm surprised it worked, but it may be because the action was fast, is the close-up shot of the founding fathers jumping out the window. And that was Leela Dowling did that animation. But I want to say that maybe because it was cartoony, like it was fast as they busted out, and then they kind of hung in the air and kind of did a crazy like, whoa, and then they dropped really fast. I want to say like that fast motion thing worked because I think what happens is it did all kinds of weird tearing and pixelation, but you couldn't see it because it went by quickly. So that ended up just feeling like motion lines or whatever, all the tearing. So it's one of those things like either you don't move a lot and it works, or you move really fast and it works. But if there's something in between, then it just looks like crap. So I don't know if that was something that we did a rough version of to troubleshoot and noticed, oh, that's fine, it goes by quickly. I don't remember. Layla might have been working that out with the programmers on that. But yeah, most of the stuff was sort of like, we also kind of got some marching orders on like, well, here's some of the new stuff you can do. We can try this, you know, like I said, don't move more than 25% of the pixels on the screen at any one time, or whatever, that kind of stuff. I think that we got general guidelines for that. And then we kind of picked our moments. What are those big screen moments that we're going to want to do for payoffs? And then we had some dumb things like, what the hell's the guy's name? The mummy, weird cousin, whatever.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, that was just he's dead, so you know, there was no animation on that, but it was still nice to get the money shot of him having won the trophy, you know. So it's like, all right, you get a close-up of that, and he's got the fake lips and he's smiling, so it's just like, and I think it was just a musical flourish, like ta-da, here he is, and he doesn't move at all, you know. But it was still fun. We figured out what are those close-up moments that we're going to want to do, you know, to kind of have payoffs, because we weren't able to do that in previous games.
Do you have a favorite animation from the game?
Gosh, I'm trying to think. There's dumb, fun little ones. Like it's interesting. I pulled together sequences. Like I like the tentacle walk cycle, because they kind of lean and struggle, but they got a suction cup, and then it pulls off and there's slime under it, and then it slaps down and sticks again. There's things like that I enjoy. Some of the little idle animations, like Bernard, just the glasses sliding off his nose. Trying to remember. I like some of the exploding cigar stuff. You mentioned that. Trying to think. And then the tentacle bowling thing, we had the close-up thing where you're bowling at the tentacles. That one was fun because you had 10 tentacles or however many it was. They all have to scatter, but they're doing different things. And that was fun to work that one out. I want to say that was because that was one of the early big, you know, money shot animations we were able to do in a game. So that was kind of a big payoff. Figure out, how do I do that? And that one I think worked okay because the perspective on it, we had the big hand and the bowling ball at the front end, but it still didn't take up a ton of the screen. And then it disappears, and then it comes in and the ball bounces, and then it kind of scales off into perspective. And the tentacles were probably not that. I think the foreground tentacles were bigger, but like once you got to the midground, they were probably the same size as the tentacle walking across the screen in a normal room, but it still felt different because it was like a different camera angle perspective than, you know, people are used to seeing kind of that side shot, you know, characters walking sideways past. So it just felt exciting because it was a different angle, you know. And then I liked the Hogue Vernard reveal animation with because that was fun. That had a bunch of characters. It had all three characters and Dr. Fred and the X-ray machine gag, and then they all had to climb out of the clothing, figure out how that worked. Anyway, it was a fun project to work on. I mean, like the weird thing, like I said, all that stuff was just, I kind of figured out how to animate on Monkey Island 2, and then just had all these crazy ideas like, oh, I want to do all this stuff now. It's like, it was a blast to work on. So, and I think, again, like I said, that was at the point where projects were still small enough that you could have a creative influence on the direction of things, in terms of, you know, setting the style, designing the characters, but I could also do a good chunk of the actual animation in the game. Like later on, like Curse of Monkey Island, I think I did a couple of animations for Blondebeard because they were these little small things, and he needed some idle animations, some quirky little things. So he scratches his butt with his hook hand, some stuff like that. It's like, oh, this needs to happen. I can do this in pixels, because all the animation for that was done on paper and then, scanned in, and it was so elaborate. But that was like, oh, the character's already in there in pixels. I can just pull that out as a frame and do a couple of funny little things to add a little more personality to them. I think that was the only thing I animated in that whole project, because we had like 10, 15 people animating, and I was trying to plan it and direct the whole thing. But Day of the Tentacle is like, I could do creative stuff, but I could also actually do a bunch of the animation. So that was fun. And you miss that when you move on to bigger projects.
Yeah, and it sounds like it was more kind of your, doing that cartoony thing is what you wanted to do originally anyway. So
yeah, it was definitely my style. I enjoyed it.
With obviously the talkie version, is there any lip sync for the animators to do or anything like that? Is there any work involved?
I'm trying to remember. I want to say that, I could be wrong. I want to say on DOTT though that I think I just created a talking cycle animation that was just a bunch of different mouth positions that look like the person is talking. And I think we just turned it on and off with audio from the voice files. It just knows audio is playing or audio is not playing. Then we did some lip sync. I don't know if there's more than one scene. The Bernard scene with the close-up where he says we've got to go back to the mansion at the beginning.
Yeah.
That one I lip synced. I'm trying to remember. At one point we ended up having a lip syncing tool. I don't know if we had it at that point or it hadn't been created yet because it wasn't even a thing. Probably not, because that was our first talkie, right? So I was like, why would you need a lip sync tool? We don't have audio. Okay. So I'm going to say no, there was no lip sync tool. I think that was just like trying to match it to the file. Eventually we ended up having a lip syncing tool where we could match the correct mouth positions to the sounds of the voice. And then I think at some point it might have even gotten automated where we had a tool that could kind of recognize some of those different mouth positions and how to match them to the sound file. But yeah, early on it was just like it plays when the voice file plays, and it does pretty well. I mean, I look at it to this day and it's like it just looks like a funny cartoon character talking,
Yeah,
because where it really falls apart is if you get into a close-up, then you want to see it lip synced properly to the funny line where they exaggerate something, and that was the back to the mansion. You got to see the right, mouth positions for that.
Thanks for making one of my favorite games of all time, and thanks for your time today. Been a
Oh,
pleasure.
you're welcome. It's exciting to hear people interested in it still. It's fun.
Yeah, I mean, are you surprised of like like Monkey Island 2 and Day of the Tentacle is still loved so much today?
That's cool. The one thing, it's great that we got the special editions on a lot of those. The one thing that still bums me out though is like they kind of cut off that money faucet on doing a special edition for Curse of Monkey Island. And it's like, oh, come on, you did it for practically every other adventure game.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's neat to see those come up again. And I guess that's probably re-sparked some interest, with the re-releases, people discover them again. It's funny, I like people talk about, oh yeah, introducing your kids to the game. I don't think any of my kids have played any of the games. And like, I even ended up a couple of years back, I used to live up in Seattle. My kids were mostly raised up there. So we went back up one summer to visit, and we ended up going to the Museum of Pop Culture up there, which is it's at the forget what it's called. It's near the Space Needle. It's like a big place with museums and whatever. And we go there, we end up in the science fiction wing. I don't know why it's in the science fiction wing, because we're looking at all these Star Wars robots and props from science fiction movies and stuff like that. And then one corner of the display, there's this screen, and there's video running of Day of the Tentacle. And I'm like, oh, okay, it's time travel. I guess that's science fiction.
Yeah.
And then I'm like, hey kids, look, Dad's game's in a museum, you know. And they're like, what's this? I don't recognize this. You made this? I'm like, none of you guys have played this.
Oh, wow.
All right. So we have a picture that we took of the family in front of the display at the museum. And then I was talking to my youngest son the other day. He's like, yeah, I think I downloaded that at some point. I played part of it. I'm like, all right, it's from the olden days.
Time flies, eh?
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, all right. Well, Pete, it was great talking to you.
You too.
Give me a heads up whenever you put the thing together and it's going online.